And these teachings on Buddha nature are really forming a bridge into the Tantra or Vajrayana level of practice. And we'll have a look at that in more detail again later in this retreat. So there are two aspects to that third turning of the wheel. The teachings that some things are real, which are the basis of Chittamatra view, and the teachings on Buddha nature.
Is there an explanation to the contradictions between the turnings of the wheel?
The explanation is that the Buddha taught according to people's capacity. So what we can understand is that they're not really contradictions, but really levels of understanding to help guide us to the deepest level. So when we look at these four philosophical systems, what we can understand is that these two can lead us to this view and then the Madhyamika view. So these are sort of levels of understanding rather than apparent contradictions.
But saying everything is real and nothing is real or something are real, these are like different statements, right?
Correct. And they are to help lead us to the deepest understanding. I mean, now in our education system, at a very young age, we're often taught things which are actually not true, but help to lead to a correct understanding. For example, I remember when I went to school, a long time ago now, and we learnt about atoms, molecules. Then we learnt that there's a solid thing in the middle, and then there's these things called electrons whizzing around that solid thing. That's what we were taught, no? Is that true? No. Is it useful? Yes. So similarly here. Of course, according to this is not true, but it's useful, because this is very difficult to appreciate. This is something we can appreciate, and it could be a stepping stone. I mean, if at primary school they taught quantum physics, I mean, I think we wouldn't understand anything, would we? So therefore, at primary school they teach something like that because it's useful, and then we move, as we go through our education, we move up to the highest level of understanding. So similarly here, similar idea. Okay. So when Buddhism then spread through the Sanskrit language to Tibet, it first spread around the 8th century. So in Tibetan Buddhism, we can talk about 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So when Buddhism first spread to Tibet, it spread in the 8th century through particularly great Indian master Padmasambhava. And through his teachings, we have what's called the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism forming. And the system of practice that Padmasambhava brought into Tibet is called Dzogchen. And this was around the 8th century. Shortly after this time, a king came to power in Tibet who didn't really like Buddhism and tried to wipe out Buddhism in Tibet. So Buddhism sort of went underground a little bit in Tibet for some centuries. And then around the 10th and 11th century, some other great Indian masters again came into Tibet to revitalize Buddhism in Tibet. And through their efforts, we have other 3 schools of Tibetan Buddhism being formed. The first of those is called the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. And this was really transmitted into Tibet through great Indian masters such as Tilopa and Naropa, and then Tibetan masters Marpa, Milarepa and Gampopa. And the system of practice that was introduced into Tibet here is called Mahamudra. The third school is called Sakya. And the system of practice that was brought into Tibet here in Tibetan is called Lamdre. Lam means path, Dre means results. So Lamdre means the paths and results. Dzogchen is also a Tibetan word, often translated as great perfection. Mahamudra is a Sanskrit word. Maha is great, Mudra is seal, the great seal. And then the fourth school we have formed is the Gelog school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the system of practice that was brought into Tibet here is called Lam Rim. Lam against path, Rim means stages. So Lam Rim is the stages of the path to enlightenment. So since these three schools, the Kagyu, Sakya and Gelog, came later, from the 10th or 11th century onwards, these three schools together are called the Sama schools. Sama means new school, whereas the word Nyingma means old school, original school. So these are the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism that formed when Buddhism was brought into Tibet. Any questions about that? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the difference between the four of them,
Right.
four of the systems?
Okay. I mean, all of these schools, of course, are part of Mahayana, so they all are striving for the goal of enlightenment, and they're all following this perfection of wisdom, the Madhyamika philosophical view. So they're all similar in that regard. One way we can sort of understand the differences in these schools is perspective. When we look at the spiritual path, and this comes up again in a couple of days' time when we talk about Mahayana and Vajrayana, the differences there, is that normally, or we can have at least two perspectives of the spiritual path. For example, the analogy I sometimes give here when I'm explaining this is, let's say we've got a dirty window and we want to clean it. One perspective is, there's a dirty window, I need to put some effort to make a clean window. That's normally a perspective we have. But also, we could have the perspective, actually, there's already a clean window there. We just need to remove the dirt to see the clean window that was always there. That's also valid. So, a little bit like that, we can distinguish here. The Gelog school, in fact, in the Lam Rim means stages of the path to enlightenment. So the Gelog is a little bit like, here we are now, there's the goal of enlightenment, these are the stages of the path we have to go through to get to that result. So that's a little bit like cleaning the dirty window, reducing the clean window. So we're looking forward on the spiritual path. The Nyingma and Kagyu tend to have the opposite perspective, that, you know, like the clean window's already there. So both of these practices are often called Dzogchen Mahamudra nature of the mind practices. And they actually tie in very closely to this idea of Buddha nature. That yes, now our mind has a lot of pollution, a lot of mental afflictions. And the Lam Rim says we need to put effort to remove those, like the dirty window. Valid. Whereas Nyingma Kagyu says, well, actually, underneath all of these mental afflictions, there's the purity of the mind. This is Buddha nature. So they have the perspective in their practices of there's already a clean window there, we just need to remove the dirt to see the clean window that was already there. So therefore, in the Gelug, we need to put effort to become Buddha. Nyingma Kagyu, there's already a Buddha inside, we just need to remove the dirt to see the Buddha that was already there. And my understanding, I haven't really studied Sakya very much, is they're a little bit sort of in between those two, the view of the yogi. So this is the enlightened view, the ordinary person's view, and this is more the yogi's view, who's sort of part way along, as a rough approximation. Any other questions? Okay. So then in the coming evenings we're going to expand on all of these details. Tomorrow we're going to look at these Four Noble Truths in detail. Then we're going to, after that, have a look at the second and third turning of the wheel in terms of Mahayana, and also touch on what's called Vajrayana or Tantra. We're going to look at these four philosophical systems that I briefly mentioned. And then after that, we're going to particularly look at this Madhyamika philosophical system, because this is the one we're following in Tibetan Buddhism, this idea of emptiness. So we're going to look at this Madhyamika system in relation to the other philosophical systems. And then, of course, on day 9, we're going to look at the Vipassana practice based on this view here. Nothing is real, this idea of emptiness. So that's all I really wanted to look at this evening. Is there any questions from anything we've covered this evening? Yeah.
Are all four school Tibetan Buddhist schools still operating right now?
Yes. And also what we find is that within these, there are also a number of, can be a number of sub-schools. Particularly in the Kagyu, you'll find that when this Kagyu school started being formed already in the sort of 11th, 12th century, already you started having some sub-schools in there. So you'll find now a number of sub-schools of Kagyu, like there's Karma Kagyu, Drupa Kagyu, Drikung Kagyu, Shanpa Kagyu, at least 4 or 5 sub-schools. They all practice Mahamudra, but each one sort of packages that a little bit differently from the others. And also I think you'll find in the other schools, maybe not so much sub-schools, but slight variations in how things are packaged. But yes, all 4 schools are certainly alive and well in the modern world, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
What do we learn? What do we learn here?
What do you mean by here? Well,
To which,
okay.
front?
So Shamatha is not even Buddhist. No? So there are many traditions that develop samadhi, concentration. So the Shamatha practice is not actually even uniquely Buddhist. And of course the Shamatha practice is developing concentration, samadhi is the general term. And in the Mahayana traditions, when we talk about this concentration practice, the one we're mainly focusing on is this shamatha, this level of concentration called shamatha. So particularly in the Mahayana tradition, certainly in the Tibetan Buddhist schools, which are Mahayana, when they talk about concentration practice, you'll hear the word shamatha. Whereas in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about concentration practice, samadhi practice, normally you won't see this word shamatha, you'll see the word jhana. Jhana is actually a higher level of concentration than shamatha. So the shamatha practice is across all Buddhist traditions, the concentration practice, and also, of course, it exists in other traditions outside of Buddhism. Now, in this retreat, we are particularly focusing on three objects. The breath, which is actually in Theravada Mahayana, in both, is quite widely emphasized. Particularly in the Theravada traditions, they use the breath a lot. And in some Theravada traditions, they particularly emphasize the abdomen. Some others emphasize the nostrils in the Theravada. But also in the Mahayana, we have the breath as an object, often. The other two objects we're using in this retreat, the mind and resting in awareness, we're particularly drawing those from the Tibetan tradition, and particularly they are most prevalent in the Kagyu and the Nyingma traditions, because in both of those, they're really nature of the mind traditions. So in Dzogchen and Mahamudra, when they do shamatha practice, they would most likely do observing the mind and resting in awareness. But these two practices of observing the mind, resting in awareness, I think also exists in Sakya and Gelug, and probably also in other, at least Mahayana traditions. So using those objects, we're drawing on particularly some of the things within these traditions here, because that's the direction for these Dzogchen and Mahamudra. But they are practiced in other traditions as well, of course. So it's not sort of a Tibetan thing.
I have two questions. How is all this related to Goenka's Vipassana? And also, how is the Dalai Lama? Like, where is the Dalai Lama?
Okay, good question. Goenka Vipassana is coming from the Burmese tradition, so this is within the Theravada tradition. So therefore, in the Goenka, and it's called a 10-day Vipassana retreat, but technically that's a little bit misleading, because for the first 3 or 4 days you don't do any Vipassana, you're doing shamatha. Although they wouldn't use the word shamatha, they would use the word anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. So that first 3.5 days of that retreat is the shamatha practice, given a different name, mindfulness of breathing at the nostrils. Because we saw that in all Buddhist traditions, shamatha, or concentration, is the basis of vipassana. So therefore, in that vipassana retreat, if we don't do some shamatha, some concentration, it's not going to work. So that's why you spend nearly 3 or 4 days, 10 hours a day, focusing on the breath here, so you can develop some concentration. Then, for the next 4 or 5 days, you go into the vipassana practice, the insight practice. And we're going to look at the Theravada vipassana, what's it look like in more detail, day, I think, 8 on this retreat. But very briefly, in the Goenka retreat, in Theravada, when they talk vipassana, they're mainly talking 3 things, 3 insights. The first one is impermanence. The second one is suffering, to know suffering. And the third one is no self. But in that retreat, because it's an entry-level retreat, you don't specifically focus on suffering or no self. You're only focusing on the first insight, impermanence. And then you're only focusing with respect to the body. Because in Theravada tradition, when they do Vipassana, they do body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. They focus on 4 different things. But in the Goenka, we're only focusing on the first of those 4, the body, and we're only looking at the body in terms of impermanence. So it's a small subset of the bigger Vipassana picture in Theravada. But often people don't realise that because that's all they've seen. So they see 10-day Vipassana, so they often think Vipassana equals scanning body. That would be like saying all humans are English. Yes, English people are humans, but not all humans are English. So scanning the body is a type of Vipassana, but there are many other types of Vipassana practice within Theravada. And then, of course, when we go into Mahayana, then even more types of Vipassana. So that's the first question about Goenka. And the second one was the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama himself belongs to the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's considered to be the spiritual head of all 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism.
I read in several places that Buddhism disappeared in India at some stage.
Yeah. So, as I said, is first these teachings here spread from India after the time of the Buddha, initially to Sri Lanka and then up through Southeast Asia. Then these systems of teachings, particularly this one, spread from about the 1st, 2nd century over the Himalayas, Silk Route, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and then between the 8th and 11th century into Tibet. 12th century, there was some invasions from the north, and they wiped out Buddhism in India from the 12th century. So you won't find Buddhism in India after the 12th century.
And Zen Buddhism?
Yeah, so Zen, of course, is Japanese Buddhism, and actually Zen is the Japanese word for Chan, which is the Chinese, and actually that is the word for jhana. So Zen is Japanese for jhana, concentration.
Yeah.
Chan is Chinese for jhana, concentration. But they're of course Mahayana. So in Chinese, in Zen, in Korean, Vietnamese, Tibetan, all are striving for the goal of enlightenment, and they all have this view of emptiness, the Madhyamika view. But we'll look at that more detail later.
What's the place of mindfulness and the Vipassana inner mindfulness?
Yeah. So remember, mindfulness is the main tool in the Shamatha practice. So the Shamatha practice is about cultivating mindfulness or strengthening mindfulness so we can concentrate better. Then in the Vipassana practice, we are applying that mindfulness to investigate the nature of reality. If we don't have mindfulness, we can't apply it very well to investigate the nature of reality. So Shamatha is about cultivating, strengthening mindfulness. Vipassana is then applying that mindfulness to gain an insight into reality. In the Theravada traditions, in Vipassana, we often have this term, the 4 applications of mindfulness, meaning we're applying mindfulness to the body, to our feelings, to the mind, and to phenomena in general, to come to some insights about these phenomena.
Regarding the question that someone asked already,
About, sorry?
Vipassana,
Yeah.
the aspect of body, scanning the body and paying attention to sensations inside the body is just one of the aspects.
Correct.
And I was thinking, and I would like you to correct me, that the reason is that sensations are the only real thing, are the basis of thoughts and feelings and emotions. So I was sure it is by purpose that we pay attention to just the sensations of the body and not related to mind.
No, I think even Goenka in his talks there talk about we should investigate within the body-mind. I think he uses the term body-mind complex. So also Goenka says we shouldn't look out there, we should look here, but here is body and mind. But in that retreat, you're only focusing on the body, because in the 4 applications of mindfulness, that comes first because it's the basis of the mind and it's more easy to investigate the body than the mind.
So you're saying that the higher level is to do this.
Well, I don't know about higher level. Next step. Next step would then be investigate feelings, mind and phenomena in general. But again, that 10-day retreat is sort of the first step, the entry level. So that's why we start with the body, and we're only looking at impermanence. We're not looking at suffering or no self. Because they are also part of Vipassana, those insights. Yeah.
It's not regarding this subject, it's something you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
Today or yesterday.
Sure.
So you said that it's that we can expect some kind of pain in the body when we try to meditate, some kind of discomfort.
That we have discomfort in the body, yes.
Yes. So I from what I understood, maybe did you mean that it's kind of why does it happen?
Why?
Yeah, and is it just physical thing because we're not used to it, to sitting like that, or is it some sort of resistance of the mind to
Both.
what we do? And if so, does it happen also in life outside of meditation?
Of course.
Do you think that we get pain?
I think we know from our own personal experience that in life we can have pain in the body, just like when we sit, we can have pain in the body. And as you rightly said, that's one thing, but then what we tend to do is we magnify that. We make it much worse than it is by having this aversion that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Because we see some pain in the body, and then we interpret that as suffering, and we go, oh, that's pain, that's suffering. I don't like that, I don't want that. And then automatically we do this. We want it to go away. But all that aversion does is it magnifies the amount of suffering we experience. And I'll use again an example from my own experience. In fact, connected to the question about the Goenka Vipassana. Many, many years ago when I first came to Buddhism, that was one of the first things I did. I did a 10-day Goenka Vipassana retreat. And part way through that retreat, there was a point where they told you to sit still for 1 hour in these sessions, don't move at all, to help overcome this tendency to do this. So there's, I think, 3 sessions a day there. They said, for 1 hour, sit perfectly still, do not move. To develop this strong determination, they said. So I was determined, but the problem was, just before that retreat, I hurt my knee in a sporting accident. So sitting cross-legged, after about 20 minutes, it got painful. And so usually before that, every 20 minutes or so, I had to move, adjust. But then when I got to this session, they said, strong determination, sit still. So I sit still. And at that time, of course, you were scanning the body, observing sensations in the body. And the instruction was also, if you got to a part of the body where there were some strong sensations, just stay there a little bit longer. So when I got down to my right knee, and this is after about 20-25 minutes, I had a lot of sensations. In fact, it was like overwhelming pain, like I was nearly passing out. And it was one singular solid pain. But then if I managed to get there with mindfulness and just be there and observe it, suddenly this one very strong, intense pain broke up, started breaking up into smaller bits of pain, and then eventually, if my mindfulness was very good, it broke up into literally thousands of intense sensations which were actually pleasant. They were intense, but they were pleasant. And so if I could sit there and just see that, it was okay. I mean, it was signalling to me to pay attention. But soon as my mindfulness went, and soon as my mind goes, oh, I know what that is, that's pain.